I am writing this now because I no longer believe the archive will remain sealed, and because I have begun to suspect that what I was instructed to digitize was never meant to be preserved in any form that could be copied. My name appears on the contract, my badge logs confirm my access, and my digital signature exists in at least 4 federal systems. That is important, because when this comes apart, someone will claim I was never there. The first irregularity was the address. The job posting listed the facility as a regional records annex under the Department of Interior, subcontracted through a private archival services firm based in Arlington. The address pointed to a rural stretch of western Pennsylvania, outside a town small enough that it did not appear on most highway signs. When I entered the coordinates into my GPS, it corrected the location twice before settling on a narrow county road that ended at a locked gate. There was no signage, no agency seal, no flag, just a rusted metal gate, a keypad mounted on a post, and a laminated notice zip tied to the fence that read, "Authorized personnel only, no deliveries without prior clearance." I arrived at 7:12 a.m. on March 3, 2019. That time matters because the man who met me later insisted I had arrived at 7:00 exactly. He corrected me twice. When I checked my car clock and phone, both still read 7:12. The gate opened after I entered the access code provided in my onboarding packet. The road beyond was paved but cracked, flanked by leafless trees and what looked like abandoned utility sheds. After about half a mile, the road dipped into a shallow valley and the building came into view. It was not large. 2 stories at most, poured concrete, no windows on the ground floor. The architecture suggested something built in the late 1960s or early 1970s, utilitarian and defensive rather than administrative. A faded government vehicle sat near the entrance, its plates unmarked. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old paper and something faintly chemical like ozone or cleaning solvent. The lobby was small, with a security desk and a sign in clipboard that already had my name typed on the next available line. I did not write my name. It was already there. A man in a gray suit greeted me. He did not introduce himself. He checked my ID against a printed sheet, handed me a badge with no photo, and said, "Your access is provisional. Do not explore. Do not connect external storage devices. Do not discuss file contents outside this building." I asked him what the archive contained. He said, "Inactive domestic records." I asked what years. He said, "That depends on the file." I was escorted through a series of locked doors into a long room lined with shelving units. Each shelf held identical gray archival boxes, labeled with alphanumeric codes and color bands. There were no descriptive titles, no dates, no agency names. My workstation was already set up, a flatbed scanner, a dedicated terminal with no internet access, and a set of printed procedures bound with a red cover. The procedures were unusually specific. Page after page of instructions on how to handle documents, how long to let the scanner cool between batches, how to log corrupted pages, how to flag non-reproducible materials. That phrase appeared often. Non-reproducible materials. On the first day, I scanned census adjustments from the early 1970s. Handwritten corrections, marginal notes, internal memos, nothing alarming. The work was monotonous, calming even. I followed the procedures exactly. At the end of the day, the man in the gray suit returned and asked me how many boxes I had completed. I told him the number. He nodded, then said, "Tomorrow you'll begin Section D." I asked what Section D was. He said, "You'll see." That night at the motel in town, I slept poorly. I had the sense of having overlooked something obvious, like a missed step in a familiar routine. I could not explain it. The next morning, my badge opened a different set of doors. Section D was located in the lower level, accessible only by elevator. The elevator required a separate code, which the man entered himself. He did not ride down with me. The room below was smaller, colder. The shelving units were older metal instead of composite. The boxes were darker, some stained, many with the same red band printed diagonally across the label area. Instead of alphanumeric codes, these boxes were stamped with a single word: null. The procedure's binder had an addendum clipped inside. It instructed me not to scan certain pages if I encountered specific markings, diagonal slashes, black triangles, or the phrase "file does not exist" printed in block letters. That phrase appeared on the first folder I opened. The contents were inconsistent: meeting minutes, internal correspondence, transcripts of interviews. The formatting suggested federal documentation, but the headers were stripped. Dates remained. Locations remained. One memo referenced a community stabilization event in 1987. The town name matched the one where the archive was located. I grew up less than 20 miles from here. I told myself that was coincidence. By mid-afternoon, I encountered a document that caused me to stop scanning entirely. It was a typed incident summary dated August 14, 1994. The subject line read, "Youth displacement, voluntary compliance achieved." The age range listed was 7-12. The facility referenced was an elementary school gymnasium. The town name was my town. I remember August of 1994 because that was the summer my third grade class lost 2 students. We were told their families had moved unexpectedly. No goodbye party, no forwarding address. I remember the assembly in the gym that fall. I remember the substitute counselor. I remember the way the teachers avoided questions. The document ended with a sentence that I read 3 times before it registered. No long-term recollection anticipated. My hands were shaking when the man in the gray suit appeared behind me. I did not hear him approach. He looked at the screen, then at the document in my hand. "That file is not to be digitized," he said. I asked him why it existed if it wasn't supposed to. He replied, "It doesn't." He took the document from me, placed it back in the folder, and closed the box. Then he said something I have not been able to forget. "You're doing very well. Most people don't recognize relevance." That night, I dreamed of fluorescent lights and folding chairs and the sound of a microphone screeching with feedback. I woke up with the word null repeating in my head like a stuck record. On the 3rd day, I found my name, not directly, not as a subject. It appeared in an attendance log attached to a post-event compliance review, dated 2 weeks after the August 1994 incident. The log listed children by initials, birth dates, and guardian names. My initials were there, so was my birth date. The guardian name was misspelled. That is how I knew it was real. When I tried to flag the file, the terminal displayed an error message I had not seen before. "This record is outside authorized memory range." I did not know what that meant. At lunch, I asked the man in the gray suit how long the archive had been operational. He said, "As long as necessary." I asked him who decided what was digitized and what was not. He said, "History does." When I returned to my workstation, the box containing the attendance log was gone. In its place was a new one, stamped in red, null recursive. That was when I realized this was not an archive. It was a filter, and I had been on the wrong side of it before. I returned the next morning with a sense of inevitability I could not shake. The previous day's discovery had not frightened me outright, but it had made the air in the archive feel different, denser, colder, as though the fluorescent lights themselves had begun to weigh on my shoulders. The man in the gray suit did not greet me at the elevator. He only appeared at the top of the stairwell, watching, impassive, until I acknowledged him with a nod. He nodded back and disappeared into the shadows of the upper floor. Section D was unchanged. The metal shelves, the gray boxes stamped null recursive, the meticulous procedures binder. Everything appeared normal, but I no longer believed it was. I approached my workstation cautiously, scanning the boxes I had been instructed to digitize. Each document felt heavier in my hands, each line of text imbued with a weight I could not measure. By mid-morning, I noticed subtle anomalies I had previously overlooked. Pages that were supposed to be single sheets were sometimes double-sided. Memos that referenced a single meeting instead described events I could not reconcile with any public record. Even the typed fonts seemed inconsistent, as though a single sheet had been produced by a different machine, in a different era, with a different typeface standard. I began to record every anomaly in a small notebook, despite the procedure's binder explicitly instructing me not to take physical notes outside the workstation. I rationalized it as a precaution, a mental exercise, but deep down I suspected that the notebook would one day be the only evidence that I had noticed. Around 2:47 p.m., the terminal displayed a new message. Access restricted. File review required. I did not request it. No one had approached me. Yet the prompt remained, blinking at the corner of the screen. I pressed enter, and the screen filled with a list of document codes I had not seen in any physical box. Some were dated decades prior, some post-dated my own childhood. One entry particularly caught my eye, D394294, subject. Local youth participation log, name redacted. I hesitated before selecting it. The terminal displayed a scanned, handwritten sheet. The letters were familiar. The cursive matched the way my third-grade teacher signed my report cards. My full name was there, as were the initials of several classmates who had disappeared in small, inexplicable waves during the same period. I closed my eyes and pressed enter again, hoping for a mistake. The screen flickered and the document vanished. In its place, a single line appeared, "You are observed." I did not move. I did not breathe audibly. I waited. Nothing happened except the hum of the fluorescent lights. When the man in the gray suit appeared again, I was still frozen. He said nothing. He only gestured toward a box labeled null, critical, and left. I approached it, hands trembling. Inside, I found a series of typed memos referencing Operational Compliance Review dated 1994, 1995, 1996. Each memo described the monitoring of children in my hometown. Each line of text was clinical, devoid of empathy, but precise, including addresses, schedules, and the names of teachers who had been instructed to remain silent. I put the box back and stepped away. The terminal then displayed another message, this one longer. Data observed. Data incomplete. Do not seek continuation without clearance. I realized I had no clearance, not for these files, not for this information, yet I could not stop. The files were a mirror of my own life, a chronicle of events I had long repressed or forgotten. The archive did not merely contain history. It had tracked it, shaped it, and in some cases ensured it unfolded according to its own design. By the fourth day, I had developed a routine. I arrived, entered the access code, passed the checkpoint, and descended to Section D. I digitized files that appeared mundane, leaving the null boxes untouched for the most part. But I could not resist the occasional glance, the brief lifting of a lid to see what had been concealed. Sometimes the boxes were empty, sometimes they contained a single sheet, and sometimes they contained multiple folders with red stamped directives I was never to read. One afternoon, I encountered a folder labeled Non-Existent Verification Required. The folder was heavier than I expected. Inside, I found handwritten notes in pencil detailing the daily attendance of children in my own elementary school in 1989. There were instructions for teachers, lists of children by height and hair color, and annotations in the margins. One note stood out, Subject 78, Monitor for Recollection. My student ID number in third grade was 78. I sat back, staring at the page until my eyes ached. The man in the gray suit appeared at the doorway, silent as always. I closed the folder and set it aside. That night in the motel, I could not sleep. The images of the pages, the lists of names, the annotations, all followed me. I tried to reason that I had stumbled upon some obscure bureaucratic exercise, a local study perhaps, but the precision and reach of the documents suggested otherwise. These were not isolated cases. They were part of a system, extensive and hidden, that had been operating in plain sight. On the 5th day, the archive's routines began to change. Doors I had previously accessed freely now required dual verification codes, 2 of which were not provided to me. The gray-suited man began appearing more frequently, walking along the shelving aisles, sometimes stopping just out of sight, sometimes standing silently behind me as I scanned. The terminal began issuing more cryptic messages. Warning, unscheduled data detected, attention required. Section D, incomplete LOGS. The more I scanned, the more the archive seemed to push back. Files I had digitized disappeared from the terminal's history. Boxes I had opened were sealed again with tape I had not touched. The documents themselves appeared subtly altered, as if the archive were correcting me, reasserting control over the narrative I was assembling. I began hearing, faintly, a whisper in my mind. Not words exactly, but suggestions, doubts, hints that I had misremembered details, that events I thought personal were administrative artifacts. I could not tell if it was the monotony of the work, the isolation, or something else entirely. I stopped telling anyone about the job, even vaguely. The archive demanded silence, but I did not need the reminder. It imposed it upon me. By the end of the 5th day, I realized with a quiet horror that the archive had my life recorded with a precision I could not have imagined. It had cataloged my experiences, my neighborhood, my school, my classmates. And now it was showing me that the boundary between observation and participation had always been blurred. The gray-suited man approached on the 6th day and handed me a single sheet of paper, folded simply. On it was written, "Knowledge is optional. Memory is required." I did not understand what it meant, but I did not need to. I already knew I could not stop. The 6th day ended with a strange unease that I could not shake. I left the archive later than usual, my steps echoing in the empty hallways. Outside, the air was sharp with early winter, yet it felt suffocating. I realized I had begun to see the city differently, streets and schools, parks and alleys, all as if mapped in some hidden ledger, a ledger I now had access to, yet could never fully comprehend. On the 7th day, I arrived with the same ritualistic precision I had developed over the past week. The gray-suited man did not appear. Section D was quiet, almost sterile. The boxes sat in their metal shelves as though nothing had changed. Yet I sensed a shift. Files I had previously ignored now seemed to call out to me. My terminal blinked insistently, demanding attention. I opened a folder labeled non-existent, high priority. Inside were documents I could not immediately place in time. Letters from my childhood teachers, photographs I did not remember being taken, and logs describing events from my early years that had always seemed ordinary. There were mentions of me, my family, neighbors I had known, all annotated with bureaucratic precision. Dates, codes, official stamps, each sheet seemed more like evidence than memory. By mid-morning, I began to notice patterns in the files, connections that had escaped me before. Entire sequences of events, seemingly coincidental, were not. They were orchestrated. They had been monitored, categorized, and perhaps influenced. I felt a rising tension, a quiet moral conflict. I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to understand, and yet I could not turn away. The terminal presented another unexpected prompt. Review, personal file D394294. I hesitated before opening it. What I found was a detailed account of my own childhood interactions, recorded as observations, experiments, and assessments. My teachers, my friends, even casual encounters on the street were described in detached, clinical terms. Every note emphasized compliance, observation, memory. Every omission was deliberate. I understood then what the gray-suited man had meant. Knowledge was optional. Memory was required. The archive was not merely a repository of documents. It had been a system designed to shape the reality of those it observed, guiding what they remembered and what they forgot. By the 8th day, my work became compulsive. I could not leave the boxes unopened. I could not ignore the terminal's blinking prompts. Each document felt urgent, each file a fragment of a hidden truth that demanded to be assembled. And yet I knew that the more I learned, the deeper I risked falling into the archive's control. I began cross-referencing files with the public record, looking for discrepancies. Every event had a counterpart in official history, but the details were wrong. Dates shifted subtly, names changed, outcomes altered. The archive had rewritten history in small increments, enough that the truth was invisible to ordinary observation, but clear to those who knew where to look. One folder in particular shook me. It contained letters from a child dated decades ago, describing events that mirrored my own fears, my own questions, my own early nightmares. The signature was unrecognizable, yet the voice was disturbingly familiar. The letters referenced experiments, monitoring, and obedience. I realized I was reading not just my past, but the past of others, carefully cataloged, carefully hidden. By the 9th day, the archive had begun to feel alive, not in the supernatural sense, but as a system of will and control. The boxes shifted slightly when I was not looking. The terminal's prompts anticipated my questions before I asked them. I felt watched not by a person, but by the institution itself, a bureaucratic entity that understood far more about me than I ever wanted it to. Late that evening, I found a folder labeled Archive Oversight Report Internal. It detailed the role of Section D in controlling memory, behavior, and perception. It outlined the purpose of tracking certain individuals, the long-term observation of children, and the subtle manipulation of public history. The document emphasized compliance, discretion, and the illusion of choice. I sat back, my hands trembling, staring at the stack of folders around me. The implications were inescapable. My life, the lives of countless others, had been observed, guided, and altered by a system that wore the mask of neutrality. The archive was not neutral. It was deliberate. It was purposeful. And it had chosen me as a witness. That night, I left the archive with a quiet understanding that my role had changed. I was no longer merely a worker tasked with digitizing records. I had become a participant, a keeper of knowledge that could not be shared. I realized I would never speak of these files openly. The system had taught me that silence was mandatory, that knowledge carried consequences beyond comprehension. As I lay in the motel room, staring at the ceiling, I understood something else. The archive does not merely store history, it shapes it. And those who uncover its truth are never the same again. I am no exception. My life has been cataloged, monitored, and influenced from the very beginning. The past I remember is real only insofar as the archive allows it to be. I do not know how many others have passed through Section D before me, how many have glimpsed the truth and returned unchanged, or not returned at all. I only know that the files continue to wait, patient, precise, indifferent. And I know that I cannot unsee what I have seen, cannot unlearn what I have learned, cannot return to the comfort of ignorance. And so I continue day after day, scanning, logging, observing, remembering. The archive has become a part of me as surely as I have become a part of it. My life, once private, is now cataloged in meticulous detail, alongside countless others, in a system designed to endure, to obscure, to control. And I am powerless to resist it. The quiet, chilling realization settles. The archive does not need to terrify through noise or spectacle. Its power lies in its inevitability, its precision, its patient, unyielding gaze. And I am its witness. By the 10th day, the archive had begun to feel less like a workplace and more like a labyrinth. Each corridor, each shelf, each row of boxes seemed to extend infinitely, as though the building itself were designed to confuse, to disorient, to test endurance. I no longer noticed the hours passing. The terminal's hum and the paper rustle became my only companions. I had begun to notice small, deliberate patterns in the documents that had previously escaped me. Certain names recurred, Children from my town, neighbors, classmates, but always in conjunction with dates and events that I could not reconcile with my memory. Entire families were cataloged, their routines, habits, even arguments documented with meticulous attention. The files implied observations spanning generations, an institutional memory of human behavior, meticulously cross-referenced and preserved. On the 11th day, I discovered a folder that chilled me to the bone. It was labeled Subject Profile, D394294, MY name and date of birth. I had always assumed these personal references were coincidental, but this file contained a complete account of my life from the earliest days I could remember. Childhood incidents I had never told anyone were written here, noted in precise bureaucratic language. Even my dreams or the fragments I had confided in diaries that were supposedly private were recorded. The archive had been watching me long before I ever entered it. I spent hours poring over the file, feeling a creeping horror at the realization that my life had never been entirely my own. Each decision, each path I had taken, seemed prefigured by entries in this meticulous record. Certain influences I had assumed were chance. Teachers who encouraged me, neighbors who advised me, were listed in the files as monitored interventions, behavioral nudges orchestrated with calculated intent. Late in the afternoon, I discovered something worse. There was a subfolder marked Actions Taken Internal. Here were descriptions of incidents in my childhood where corrective measures had been employed, often without my knowledge. Subtle manipulations, suggestions, rearrangements of circumstance, all aimed at guiding me towards certain outcomes. I realized that not only had my life been cataloged, it had been engineered. A cold realization began to settle. If my life had been influenced, then perhaps the lives of others had been too. The archive was not merely a passive record. It was a system of control, capable of shaping the future by controlling access to information, by nudging behavior, by quietly orchestrating reality through oversight, surveillance, and intervention. I felt a moral tension I had never known before. I could not destroy these files. I could not warn the public. They would never believe it, and even if they did, the system was too pervasive, too entrenched. I could not ignore it either. The truth demanded acknowledgement. I realized my role was neither passive nor neutral. I was now a witness, a participant, an unwilling custodian of knowledge that could not be shared. Late that evening, I found an internal memo labeled Oversight Protocol, D394294. It outlined the archive's procedures for individuals who discovered classified materials. The instructions were precise: containment of information, psychological evaluation, monitoring for disclosure attempts. The consequences were left implied but unmistakable. It became clear that the gray-suited man, the subtle prompts, even my assigned workload were part of a mechanism to test, guide, and ultimately ensure compliance. By the 12th day, I could feel the psychological weight pressing on me. The archive was patient. It did not threaten. It did not raise its voice. It simply existed, precise, meticulous, and unrelenting. And in that quiet, unyielding presence, I understood the full scope of its power. Knowledge was not just power, it was a chain, and I was bound by every file I had touched. I began to see the implications ripple outward. Entire histories, communities, even nations were susceptible to manipulation when information could be selectively curated, hidden, or emphasized. The archive was a microcosm of control, a demonstration of what could be done when a system had patience and authority, when secrecy was maintained with precision. The final revelation came unexpectedly, not as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet, undeniable truth. Hidden in a folder buried beneath hundreds of others was an internal report, one that explicitly referenced my life and the lives of people I had known. Long-term behavioral observation and outcome confirmation, D39 4294 and associated subjects. Compliance maintained. No anomalies noted. It was not merely a statement. It was a verdict. I had been monitored, my life adjusted, my awareness tested. And in the final evaluation, the archive had deemed me compliant enough to continue observing. I was alive, but no longer merely free. My choices were informed, my memories curated, my future subtly guided. I left the archive that night, walking the empty streets of a city that now seemed both familiar and entirely alien. The cold wind bit at my face, yet the unease inside me was far colder, far more penetrating. I realized the quiet horror of my situation. Survival was not liberation. Knowledge was not power. And ignorance, once lost, could never be regained. I returned to my motel room, staring at the documents I had copied and scanned. I could not destroy them. They had already altered me. The archive had ensured it. The quiet, meticulous, inevitable machinery of oversight had changed the person I once was. And in that moment, the final, inescapable truth settled over me. The archive does not need to strike with force to terrify. Its power lies in its patience, its precision, its total control over what we know, what we remember, and what we think we choose. And I am its witness. The days after I submitted the last batch of digitized files were oddly silent. The office remained operational, yet I sensed a subtle distance in the way colleagues interacted with me. Meetings were still scheduled, procedures still followed, but conversations felt measured, cautious. My supervisor no longer asked for progress updates. Instead, he would nod briefly, eyes shifting as though aware of something he could not, or would not, say aloud. I began to realize that I was no longer just an employee performing a job. I had become a participant in something far larger and more secretive than I had imagined. I continued to receive occasional messages from the main office, brief instructions to review obscure folders or verify document numbers. Each request felt like a test, a subtle reminder that I was being watched, though never directly. There were no threats, no overt pressure, just a sense of observation that never left me. The files I had digitized, the evidence of actions buried by the state, were now part of a system I could not influence. I knew in the coldest part of myself that what I had uncovered could never be revealed. Any attempt to share it would be swiftly contained. At home, my own memories began to shift. Faces from my childhood, long forgotten, resurfaced with unsettling clarity. Locations I had passed by as a child, events I had dismissed as trivial or imaginary, were now framed in a context I could not ignore. The connections were too precise, too deliberate to be coincidental. The government files I had handled were not just historical records. They were part of a network that had touched my own life in ways I was only beginning to understand. The unease followed me everywhere, in the streets, in the quiet hum of my apartment, even in dreams that blurred the line between memory and evidence. I no longer kept a schedule. I stopped marking pages, stopped noting times. I walked through the corridors of the archive with a sense of detachment, aware that the place was no longer simply a building, but a repository of truths too dangerous to confront directly. I felt the weight of the files I had digitized pressing down upon me, as if they carried with them a responsibility I could neither refuse nor discharge. Every sound, the distant clatter of typewriters, the shuffle of papers, echoed with the presence of things unspoken, deeds that had been performed and erased, lives that had intersected with my own without my knowledge. Eventually, I stopped visiting the archive entirely. Yet even in absence, its influence remained. Documents I had touched seemed to linger in my mind, phrases repeating themselves in subtle, insistent ways. I caught myself noting patterns, wondering how much was coincidence, how much had been intentionally hidden. I realized I could not unsee what I had seen, could not unknow what I had known. The files existed now both as data and as a shadow over my life. And so I live with this quiet unease. I am alive, yet changed. The official world continues, moving with its normal cadence, indifferent to the invisible tracks left behind in its hidden corridors. I am a witness to something I can never speak of openly, and perhaps that is the most enduring horror. To hold knowledge that cannot be acted upon, to feel the weight of a truth that has no outlet. The archive, the files, the people whose lives were recorded and erased, they all persist in my mind, and I persist with them. Nothing has resolved, nothing will, and I am left with the slow, unending realization that some truths are too dangerous, too precise to ever be shared. The government never acknowledged the files, and the world outside remains unchanged. But for me, the change is permanent, a quiet, unspoken mark that cannot be erased. I live each day aware that history, memory, and power are intertwined, and that some doors once opened can never truly be closed.